In this sublesson, we'll see how to implement AAA and RBAC on MDS 9000 switches. The AAA configuration and RBAC configuration is pretty much similar to how we configure AAA and RBAC on Nexus switches, the running NXOS. So this is MDS 9K switch, so show version, and it is running 8.2.2 version of software, and we have MDS 9132T. And once we are on the config mode, we can say radius server host 172.168.31.100, and we can define the key, let's say secret 1, and we can also define a radius server with using a different port number. So we can have host number 172.168.31.101 and say auth port, and here we can set port number as say 2000, and we can set the key as well. We can set the key by saying secret 2, and then we can go ahead and configure radius server 172.168.31.102, and if I want to set the accounting for the particular radius server, I can enable accounting as well. And if I want to do the accounting on a different port number, I can use a different port number using the account port configuration. So I'm enabling accounting for this host I can set it for the host number 100, and we should be good. And we can get rid of this 102, and we are done with this. And once we have defined the radius server, we can go ahead and configure the AAA to use the radius server. So we go under the AAA configuration and say AAA group server radius, and I can say the group name as radius server, and under this I can define the servers as 172.168.31.100, and I can say server 172.168.31.101, and after that I can run the command show radius server groups, and I can see the groups that I have created. So if you notice here, the authentication port is changed to 2000. The counting port is still 1813 that we set it to default, but we can change it as well. But on this 101, the auth port is changed from port to 2000, then the default of 1812. So this is currently the server 172.168.31.100 is using the default authentication and accounting port numbers. So similarly, we can configure TechAX server configuration, but for that we need to enable feature TechAX plus, and once we enable the feature, only then we can configure the TechAX plus servers. So we'll quickly see how to configure the TechAX plus servers, and so we can go ahead in the config mode and say TechAX server, and under the TechAX server we say host 172.168.31.100, and we can define the port number as well if you want. Remember, the default port number is 49, but if you want, we can say it as port number, let's say 2000 as well. So we can set it to 2000, and remember to use the key. I mean, you don't have to configure in the same line, but you can use the next line to configure the key as secret 1, let's say. And you can also specify the timeout values for the TechAX servers using the option timeout, and say timeout value is like 25 seconds. So you can set that value as well. And once you're done with that, then you can go under the AAA configuration and say AAA group server TechAX plus, and name the group TechAX underscore group, and under this you can specify the server 172.168.31.100, and we should be good. So if I look at the command output for show TechAX server statistics, and I can statistics for the specific server 172.168.31.100, I'll see the respective statistics for authentication, authorization, and accounting. And I can also check the TechAX server group. So show TechAX server groups. I can see the group that we created with the AAA configuration, and I can see the TechAX server on port 2000. So we can use these commands to validate or look at it in detail about the configuration that we are enabling on the MDS switch. Once you have done that, the next step is you can also enable LDAP. For that, you need to enable LDAP feature on the MDS switch. And when you're defining the LDAP server, you need to make sure you're using SSO and defining the root domain name and the password, all that information while configuring the LDAP integration for the MDS switches. So I'll show you a quick example on how you can enable LDAP integration or configure LDAP. So we enable LDAP feature and say LDAP server host 172.168.31.200 and say enable SSL. So we are using SSL which is going to help us with the integrity and confidentiality of the data that we are exchanging between the LDAP server and the LDAP client. So it's going to use SSL. And we can then use LDAP-server command to say host 172.168.31.200. And we can define root domain name as CN equals, I can say director, or I can even say engineer, and say DC equal my DCN, my data center, and I can say DC equal com, and say password, I can say Cisco, and timeout value of 30. So there's a space, I should remove the space, and there's a typo here, timeout value of 30. So we are good with this configuration, and then we can define the port number. So LDAP server port, so LDAP server host 172.168.31.200, and we should have the option for defining the port number as say let's say 2100 as the port number, and then we can set the timeout values or the dead time as well, like we saw here, the timeout and the dead time in case they become unreachable. And then under the AAA configuration, we can say AAA group server, and then we can define the LDAP group, say LDAP underscore group, and we can then say under that group, we can specify the server 172.168.31.200, and that should take care of it. You might also want to define the authorization for the group that you created for LDAP, so AAA authorization, and say SSH certificate, and the default for, and the group that you're specifying here, so which is our LDAP group. So we paste it here, and that should take care of the configurations. So we can look at the command show LDAP server groups, and this will show us the configuration that we did for the LDAP underscore group. And we can look at the other settings that we defined, like the root domain name. All the settings are available or seen here. So this is how we can enable LDAP on MDS 9000 switches. Now we'll take a close look at how we can configure RBAC on the MDS switches. So for defining the RBAC, we can go into the config mode and say role name, and we can create our own role. So we already have a server admin role that is present, but we can say SAN group as the user role, and then we can define the rules how we define on NXOS. Say rule 1, or it's going to permit for configurations, and rule 2, it's going to permit for feature. So under the config, we can say feature, and the feature name can be like zoning, we can use the zone feature, or we can use any other feature. So and rule 3, if I want to define permit for running any debugs, if this user has the permission to run the debugs for the particular feature as well. So debug for feature, and I can set it for zone as well. So he cannot run the debugs for any other feature but for the feature zone. And rule 4, if I want to run some pings like the fabric pings, I can enable rule 4 and permit from the exec. I can enable it for a feature, and then I can specify the feature. So if I want to run the exec commands, I can specify zone as well, but if I want to run a different feature, I can enable that as well. And if I want to run any or remove any rule, I can always say no rule, and that particular entry will be removed. So that's how we define the roles. And once under the groups, under the role itself, we can also define the vSAN policy for this role. So we can say vSAN policy, and we can specify if it's deny access to the vSAN unless specifically permitted. So we need to, under this policy, we can say vSAN policy deny and say permit vSAN, let's say 2 to vSAN 100. And we are permitting these vSANs, and then we can exit. So if I look at the show role name SAN group, I'll see the permissions that or the rules that I defined, and it's permitted for vSANs 2 to 200, but everything else is denied. So this is the policy that I've created, or the role that I've created, and then I can go ahead and say username, and I can say new SAN admin, and I can set the role as my new role that I defined. So the name of the role is the SAN group, and then I can set the password to let's say SAN exclamation 123 at DC, and I can define the password, and this is how we can enable the user now. So if I look at show user account and look at my new user, it's part of the SAN group that I created. So this is how you can implement RBAC or role-based security on the MDS 9000 switches.